what is overwhelmingly the most surprising case of competitive authoritarianism, which is, my home country, the United States. They aren't like professionals in the FBI or Billy Long, who heads the IRS, who their only qualification is their loyalty to Donald Trump. But what you're seeing right now is a wholesale attack on the university as such in the United States, right? That is completely new. And that's another area where there's, serious violations of democracy that you just haven't seen before. I predicted a lot. I predicted, the purging of the bureaucracy. I did not predict the sort of a wholesale wanton destruction of the federal government. This is truly baffling. Democracy, cannot survive under those circumstances.
My guest today is Dr. Lucan Way, who is a political scientist. He's one of the sharpest minds when it comes to understanding how democracies die, or more accurately, how they erode. I'm holding two of his books in my hands. This one, Competitive Authoritarianism, is about regimes that look democratic on paper, but are not. And this is going to be the foundation of today's conversation. It's a great book. It's co-authored by Dr. Lewitsky, just like this one. And this one, titled as Revolution and Dictatorship, this one is a sweeping exploration of how violent revolutions give birth to some of the most durable dictatorships. And I hope I can get him to do another episode just on this book, but we'll see. So stay tuned for that. But I'm sure you're going to love this episode just like I did. All the links in the description box, and see you on the other side. Perfect. Thank you so much for showing up. We have a lot to talk about, so many big ideas, but before all of that, I'm very interested in your intellectual lineage. And so if you could explain some of the formative moments when you look back on your career, or some key figures who shaped your political worldview.
Great. Yeah. So I'm, first of all, American. So I was born in New York City, grew up in California, went to undergraduate at Harvard, and then did my graduate degree at Berkeley. I only came to Canada in 2006. I think I'd been to Canada twice before then. But I've been here, quite a long time, almost 20 years now. So I feel very Canadian. Basically, I was very much shaped by, when I was in university, it was a period I was interested in Russian politics when the Soviet Union was undergoing significant reforms. There was a policy of perestroika. So the Soviet Union was transforming from a totalitarian state to a much more open society. And I was studied there, actually with Christy Freeland, a good friend of mine, in the late 1980s in Moscow. So it was a period of tremendous and exciting political change. And so that's really what sort of got me interested in politics, was sort of being at this period where suddenly it felt like, that what was possible was suddenly opened up enormously. However, sort of hopes for democracy, especially in Russia, were quickly dashed, I think, by the mid-1990s, in 1993, when President Boris Yeltsin of Russia bombed the parliament. And what you saw emerging was something that was clearly not democracy, but clearly sort of had elements of democracy. And so this is where my co-author and I, in the early 2000s, came up with the term competitive authoritarianism. My co-author is Stephen Levitsky, who's now at Harvard. And basically, these are regimes that, combine, have sort of regular and genuinely competitive elections, but all sorts of authoritarian abuse.
Yeah, we're going to talk a lot about that. But, before we talk about the main idea of this amazing book, I have to say, as a grad student, I'm very impressed that every page that I turn to, it has 10 to 20 citations. And the level of research behind this book is insane. I cannot fathom how much effort and time you put into this. So I'm asking you this as a grad student. What is your writing process?
So basically, I write about, my co-author and I write about a number of cases, but basically our strategy is to literally read everything there is about a case, and really get to know the case well. So in this case, competitive authoritarianism, we had 35 cases. We kind of split the cases more or less in half. And then we just, delve deeply into the secondary and sometimes primary literature. So I think that is, we kind of have a much more qualitative approach. Neither of us are particularly quantitatively oriented, but so we don't do statistical analysis, but we get to know a case really well, and in order to sort of engage in what political science we call process tracing, where you're just like looking at causal processes across time. But definitely, like, it involves really knowing the case incredibly well, not just relying on one or two sources.
Interesting. Because, as someone who's doing PhD in genetics, I've always thought, like, when people say political science, what is that science? What does that mean? And how does it manifest in, like, say, writing a book in politics?
Right. So, I think that term, it's obviously there's a lot more uncertainty when it comes to politics. And to sort of talk about science at one level feels inappropriate. You cannot do, experiments or you can do it, but that's not the kind of work I do. But you can create sort of falsifiable hypotheses, right, that can be tested with the data. So I think there is it's a broadly speaking, a scientific approach in the sense that you have hypotheses, and you basically assess how much they fit the existing data. So again, at broad level, it is, I think a science in a broad sense.
Yeah, I see. Okay, so the big question: what is competitive authoritarianism?
So competitive authoritarianism are regimes that have regular elections that are genuinely competitive, that there is a chance that the opposition will win. There's also cases in which opposition is allowed to operate openly. They're not sort of in exile or in prison, right? And they're allowed to campaign in elections, and electoral fraud is, sometimes exists, but is sort of not so overwhelming that the elections are kind of pure facade. But in which there's all sorts of abuse. So this is, in terms of harassment of journalists and sometimes, harassing and sort of attempting to disqualify opposition leaders and the like. So it's really not democratic, but it has, really important elements of democracy.
Interesting. And so what is really striking is that you and your co-author conceptualized this idea, I think mostly to make sense of post-Cold War regimes. But now you have raised the alarm that the U.S. is on the path to become one of these states. So how do you justify your case?
So basically, as you said, this term was really exactly right. We sort of used to kind of look at post-Cold War cases, cases that, broadly speaking, part of what, we call the third wave of democracy that emerged in the 1980s and 1990s that sort of have elections, but sort of, had all sorts of abuse as well. So, the cases that we examine in our book, Competitive Authoritarianism, which was published in 2010, are all those kinds of cases. But since then, since we published the book in 2010, there have emerged a number of other cases, particularly Hungary, Turkey, India, that have really come at it from the other end. These are cases that were established democracies, but in which democracy has degraded to a significant extent, and sort of they become competitive authoritarian states. And so the sort of most obvious cases in recent decade are sort of India, Hungary, and Turkey and Poland and Brazil for a bit of time. But now what I think naturally the focus is really on, I think, what is overwhelmingly the most surprising case of competitive authoritarianism, which is, my home country, the United States. What's interesting about this case is that by any kind of standard social science measure, United States democracy should be very robust. There's one professor, Daniel Treisman at UCLA, who did a kind of statistical analysis based on historical data, and he came to the conclusion, this is in 2023, that the United States had a 1 in 333 chance of becoming an authoritarian regime. So basically zero, for all intents and purposes, chance of becoming, of democratic breakdown. But here we are.
Yeah. So why do you disagree with that?
Well, I'm not in a position to disagree with the numbers. I mean, this chances, maybe, even something that has a 1 in 333 chance has a chance of happening.
Yeah. But why do you think U.S. is on that path?
Well, I think it's already become competitive authoritarian as of now, and what is it now? April 14th, 2025. And basically, the way to look at it, sort of, is in a democracy, there is no cost for going into opposition, right? Here in Canada, if you oppose the government, you don't have to worry about retribution from the government. You don't have to worry about things like, getting audited by the CRA or the IRS. You don't have to worry about being investigated. If you're a business person, you don't have to worry about your business opportunities or chances of getting a contract are diminished and the like. But under competitive authoritarianism, that is something you have to worry about, right? That you have to, of being harassed, and that has definitely become the case right now. I think specifically, first of all, you've had people in the officials, most recently in the FBI, who have been targeted for investigation simply because they were involved in investigating Donald Trump. So these are purely political investigations. You also have, the law firms that have represented the Democratic Party or have been involved in suits against Donald Trump. They have been denied security clearances, access to federal buildings, and been told that they will no longer get business from the federal government. So they're being actively punished in a way that, greatly, damages their bottom line, their ability to do business. And so, for them and for others, there's a real cost in opposing the government. So by that measure, I think the United States is clearly a competitive authoritarian regime. It's not like Russia, right? You don't have people in jail or being assassinated and the like, but it is clearly, we've gone from a situation in which there was no cost of, supporting one of the major parties in which there's a clear cost.
Yeah. What about like other factors? So you mentioned cost of opposition, but do you think there are other factors involved? Because ultimately what we're saying is that the playing field is so skewed that there is no real chance for Democrats to win the next election.
So it's definitely not that. It's what remember, a competitive authoritarian regime is a case in which opposition is allowed to function. It's not banned. There are still competitive elections, but in which one side it's a tilted playing field, and one side faces disadvantages because the government uses its control over the state bureaucracy to target the supporters of the opposition in a way that they don't for the other party. So in that sense, I think it's I think elections still matter. I don't think in any way that the Democratic Party has been completely sidelined. That would be very hard. A lot of competitive authoritarian regimes, as the United States, can have a very robust opposition, right? That doesn't necessarily preclude that. It just means that there's enough abuse that essentially people have to think twice before going into opposition. And you really already see that in the United States. You already see evidence that donors, feel nervous about, facing retribution if they give to the Democratic Party or center left or left wing causes. There's been a kind of chilling effect among donors, and so in a moment of sort of clear democratic crisis, already a number of NGOs in the United States have had to cut back staff because people are less willing to sort of give money. So you already see this real cost. It's become harder for members of the Democratic Party to find legal representation because people are really afraid of the law firms are afraid of retribution, by the presidential administration. So you really, these are real costs right now.
Yeah.
So this is
I see. So let's go through some of the pushbacks that I'm sure you probably get all the time. One of them, do you think you're underestimating the power of American institutions and the history of democracy in the U.S.?
Well, I'm just, I think, first of all, when we say it's competitive authoritarianism, does not mean in any way that this is, not reversible. I mean, I think, if I were, to bet, I would bet that this is not going to consolidate. And I think, that there's still, U.S. democracy still has a number of resources. I'm just talking about the point of view right now. right? Doesn't mean that, we're there forever or that it's somehow going to become like Hungary or Turkey or whatnot. It just means that right now there's a high cost of opposition. So I think there's a lot that the sort of, small d democratic, movements have on their side. There's you still have a kind of a very highly developed middle class that have a lot of resources to give to the Democratic Party. You still have, large numbers of wealthy people in independent universities. And so I think there are a lot of resources, to fight authoritarianism right now in the United States.
Yeah. So how do you think this administration is different from his first term? Like, do you think maybe we're just blowing this out of proportion because he has been a president before and nothing horrible to this degree happened?
Right. So I think that, it's true that in his first term, things, were okay. But that was a very different circumstance. So here in the first term, he was basically emerged as an outsider within the Republican Party. He had almost no allies. And the Republican Party and his appointees, by necessity, because he didn't have people who were loyal to him, were people from the kind of Republican small d democratic establishment, people who still kind of believed in the rule of law, and therefore actually sort of held him in check during his first term, right? But the thing is that since then, he's had 8 years to create a Republican Party in his image. So the appointees, and he also prepared the, Project 2025, funded by the Heritage Foundation. They prepared. I mean, you have to kind of admire them in a sense that they really kind of, went through. And first of all, he's appointed people like Kash Patel, the head of the FBI, who are pure loyalists, right? They aren't like professionals in the FBI, or Billy Long, who heads the IRS, who their only qualification is their loyalty to Donald Trump, which makes one, even without all this stuff that's going on right now, you can feel fairly confident that he's in a position to at least attempt all sorts of abuse. And this was not the case in the first term. And so, and also his kind of their blatant willingness to kind of just ignore court orders, right? And so this is all kind of, I think that, this is all, quite disturbing and something that I think, the Americans need to grapple with.
Next one, if it doesn't violate Constitution, can we really blame him?
Well, first of all, he is violating the Constitution. He is he's ignoring court orders. And Elon Musk is, they're firing people they have no right to fire, from the federal bureaucracy, and they're not funding activities that, congressionally appropriated funds. So they're directly violating the Constitution. This is, I think what they call in political science a self-coup, which is where one branch of government basically overrides another. It's in a more ambiguous situation because you have a Republican-controlled Congress who's not willing to fight Trump for partisan reasons, but nonetheless, you have congressionally appropriated funds that they're just not distributing, which is illegal. So I think there is a violation of the Constitution, and Musk, who has no security clearance, no background checks. He's kind of a temporary. It's not really clear what he is, but he's sort of his power is this way out of line in terms of he's violating basic congressional power. But this is still but at the same time, it should be emphasized that even within the Constitution, Jim Crow in the South was clearly non-democratic, but within the constitutional, so just because it's within the framework of the Constitution does not mean it's democratic. That's worth pointing out. So,
let me read you some comments. This is from your another interview with your co-author. So it says, I'm listening to this description of competitive autocracy, and the thought crossed my mind. You know who's really familiar with this? Libertarians and Greens. We have been a competitive autocracy for most of the U.S. history, just with the two-party system taking the place of a single cohesive party.
There's no definition of democracy that says that you have to have more than a two-party system. The point about democracy is that you have to opposition again has to be without cost. It does not in any way say that the Greens or you have to have third parties. That's not part of any kind of definition of democracy. So,
yeah. So another comment is that, okay, I'm going to read the whole thing.
Sure.
I think not acknowledging the extent to which many of these same issues have and do exist in the Democratic Party as well only hurts your case, making it appear biased and partisan. And then they say perhaps they don't do it with one authoritarian leader like Trump, but with an elite autocracy. I believe there are many moderate Republicans who are wary of what you are describing, but who feel it was the only choice available in response to the very liberal agenda being thrust upon many of the American people who could no longer abide it. So basically, like, there's also a cost of opposition in the other side as well. Like, we have cancel cultures and so many other things.
Well, first of all, that's no longer the case, but you've never had a situation in which, law firms have been targeted. The legal establishment has been targeted for supporting one party over the other. You've never had a situation in which people have been investigated simply because, they oppose President Biden or, President Obama. This is a totally novel situation. You've never had a situation in which donors for the Republican Party have been, cowed and feel like they are unwilling to give money to the Republican Party because of the fear of retribution. This is a totally novel situation. There have been some, claims on the other side, but just haven't been borne out. That the politicization of the IRS, people claim was under the Obama administration. But I think that there's nothing. There's basically no there. I do. I will sort of say one thing. I do think there's one bit of sort of evidence for the other side, which is, there's a term that we use called lawfare, which is, a case where you kind of use the law to go after certain politicians because, you use the full extent of the law in ways that you wouldn't if there was another target. Now, Trump has clearly violated the law, a number of things, and there were a number of issues, court cases that he had before him, but the one case of where he was actually prosecuted for hush money, I think is a case in which, probably if he wasn't the defendant for Stormy, this is where he gave hush money for Stormy Daniels, and he did violate the law. And this, in this case, did go before a jury, and he was convicted. This is, really within the confines of the law. Nonetheless, I think it's pretty clear that if it hadn't been Donald Trump, they probably wouldn't have used the law in this way. That's the one case. But nonetheless, the Republican Party has been able to engage in all sorts of opposition activity without any sort of cost, and nothing comparable to what you see going on right now. So this is really novel. So,
yeah. Another one, and let it be the last one. So you have been training your eyes to see this specific pattern of competitive authoritarianism, which means that we should take your words very seriously because you're an expert. But on the other hand, what if you're just so focused on this one pattern that maybe this is kind of like a cognitive bias and like it's like a false positive at this point?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So people can go and they can say that I'm wrong. I mean, but clearly, we know it's an objective fact they are targeting these law firms. I mean, you can say it has never been done before. So if you think it's been done before, you want to falsify that. Well, tell me sort of how the Democratic Party has done something equivalent. Tell me. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, another question that arises is, sort of, past American history, right? So, things were not perfect, and certainly there was a harassment, historically of sort of civil rights activists. In some cases the far right in the 1960s under President John F. Kennedy and the like, in the use of IRS for politicized purposes. And also attack on kind of campus radicals in the 60s and 70s. All this was very much the case. But what's different now is that where there historically were sort of attacks on those on the kind of political margins, members of the kind of socialist IWW and in the Red Scare at the turn of the century, this is really the first time in the last 100 years when mainstream establishment opposition has been actively targeted. This is new. This is brand new, right? So that, so this is kind of takes violations to a whole new level that did not exist. I mean, to give you an example, under Richard Nixon, who was president in between 1968 and 1974, they targeted campus radicals, right, who were opposed to the war in Vietnam. They never attacked the university as such. But what you're seeing right now is a wholesale attack on the university as such in the United States, right? That is completely new. And that's another area where there's, serious violations of democracy that you just haven't seen before.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's like a blueprint for competitive authoritarian regimes? Because, like a few weeks ago, I was talking to Dr. Kalmar and we were comparing Viktor Orban to Trump. So do you think like he's taking a page out of Orban's playbook or something?
I think there definitely are similar. I think as Stephen Levitsky and I sort of argue in our foreign affairs piece, one of the biggest sort of impediments to authoritarianism isn't so much civil society, but sort of the government bureaucracy, whose allegiance is not to the government in power, but to the Constitution, right? So those sort of their arm's length. And, in both cases, in Hungary and Turkey and Poland, there was a kind of efforts to undertake a wholesale purge of the professional bureaucracy so that they would basically be able to be replaced with loyalists. And which is, I think, what you're seeing now, that the sort of independent, government administration who have very secure sort of employment protections, are really at the front lines of protecting democracy in almost all established democracies, in Europe and the United States. So in all these cases where you've seen the emergence of competitive authoritarianism, one of the first steps, and this is part of that playbook, is to attack this bureaucracy because and to basically cow them into obedience.
I love that you brought up bureaucracy because I want to talk about Elon Musk specifically. To be honest with you, I kind of give him the benefit of the doubt. I just think he's a guy coming from the Silicon Valley culture. He cares about efficiency and making more money. I think for him, it's mostly personal frustration. For example, like every time he wants to launch a rocket, he has to go through like 700 steps of environmental regulations, or like he wants to be able to hire hungry immigrants that are willing to work overtime and on the weekend pursuing the American dream. And I think like this is what he's pursuing here. He doesn't have a chainsaw for a democracy. So to ask you a question, he reposted this a few days ago on Twitter, and it said, Elon Musk is not the enemy of democracy. He is the enemy of bureaucracy.
Well, bureaucracy is essential to democracy. So that isn't. I mean, I actually see no reason why you would take Elon Musk, the benefit of the doubt. I mean, he claims to find all this fraud. He's clearly lying, enormously about, what he's, he has no business basically fiddling around. I mean, it's illegal what he's doing right now. So whether I don't know what's in his head or like whatever, but what he's under, his basically, he's sending, his officials with their backpacks into, the sort of core of the American bureaucracy, the places where like they create social security checks, and they basically, in order to get there, they've had to lower all sorts of security, precautions, and so it's actually very dangerous what's going on right now. I mean, if nothing else, for identity theft, he's sort of opened up the floodgates, and you can imagine we don't even know yet, all sorts of sort of abuse, and again, sort of by, USAID, these are already government appropriated funds. I mean, this is not non-democratic, right? He's violating the Constitution. So I have no idea. I mean, I don't see any reason to take him as, benefit of the doubt, but he's clearly engaging in unconstitutional behavior. It takes the legal system time, and he's obviously benefiting from the fact that Trump supports him, but I don't see any reason. I mean, it's, this is a self-coup. This is a coup.
Yeah. So, but to what extent do you think we need bureaucracy to have a good democracy?
The modern state, is an incredibly powerful entity. It can arrest you. It can audit you. It can affect whether or not you have a profitable business or an unprofitable business. No democracy can survive unless it's independent of the government. So what's going on right now, and this is what Musk is doing by firing he's cowing them into obedience, and he's politicizing the government. So the democracy, cannot survive under those circumstances. It's easy to deride these bureaucrats, but and the regulations. But then, if you have problems with the regulations, then you work through the laws and the rules, and you change those rules. You don't engage in they're basically, what they're doing is incredibly nihilistic by firing literally all probationary employees. That's not making it more efficient. That's just destroying. That's just wholesale destruction of things like that. We all, nuclear safety, food safety, to make sure that people in the United States don't eat poisoned food. I don't see how this has really anything to do with efficiency, right? I think it's actually quite a mystery, what's going on. Like, why would you want to not make it undermine the ability to these weather balloons to predict weather? It is truly baffling, I have to say. I did, this one thing I predicted a lot. I predicted, the purging of the bureaucracy. I did not predict the sort of a wholesale wanton destruction of the federal government. This is truly baffling. And you have to, I think, part of it is he's treating the United States as a kind of startup where he can just fire everyone. But, this is, the United States is not a startup.
You briefly touched on some other historical moments in the U.S. history. If you want to learn from the history, how did we bounce back from those events?
Well, I think, part of what's going on is that, I think, I think we have a very robust, and part of the issue is that we've actually, since the Civil War, never faced this kind of challenge. So we're kind of in novel territory. But at the same time, I think, there are a couple of things that I think make it, hard for me to believe that Trump will succeed or that Musk will succeed. The first is the sort of the high levels. The United States is far richer and more economically developed than these cases. It's per capita, 7 times larger, richer than Hungary was in 2010. It's, 9, when democracy broke down in Argentina in 1976, it's 9 times as rich. And so the much more developed private sector, you have, hundreds, thousands of billionaires in the United States. It's really hard to monopolize power successfully in the United States. But you also have another thing which I think makes it less likely that authoritarianism will succeed, is that Trump himself is very unpopular. So, autocracy succeeds when you have, in cases like, Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, or, Russia in the early 2000s, when, you had sort of 80% support. Right now, Trump is by most measures underwater 7%. He is the mid to low 40s. And he's really kind of shooting himself in the foot. So, we have everybody, of course, knows about what's going on with the tariffs, which is awful for the global economy. But I have to say, in terms of democracy, this is a real godsend, because he's just, he's destroying the economy, and which makes it, he's people don't like it when when the bond market and the stock markets, collapse. And so I think that's going to make it that much harder for him to successfully, maintain a kind of competitive authoritarian regime.
Yeah. So since you wrote your piece on foreign affairs, are you now more optimistic or pessimistic?
Well, I'm definitely. I think we were kind of, there are a few sentences in there that feel kind of Pollyannish, or kind of assumption that of the independence of the courts and stuff. I think I worry that the administration just now is, the courts issue a ruling, they just ignore it. And it's since the presidential administration is responsible for enforcing the law, there's actually not a whole lot that can be done, at least in the short term. And so that really is worrisome. This is, they kind of cut funding, and then the courts tell them to renew funding, and they just ignore it. So this is an openly anti-constitutional administration. And so that is, very concerning. You also have, cases of these deportations, only tangentially related to democracy, because they're not, sort of, for the most part, for kind of political opposition. They're of non-citizens and the like. But the willingness to kind of flagrantly ignore the rule of law, I think, is broadly speaking, concerning in terms of the future of democracy in the United States.
Yeah, I think I'm much more optimistic, given everything you said, because I thought we were past the turning point. But you're saying it's probably something transient and doesn't consolidate, which is a good news.
Yeah, no, it is good news, but it's still very serious, and we're not, out of the woods. And so some people, it's always reversible, and so I think that we should never, think it's somehow irreversible. I mean, if you look at the history of competitive authoritarian regimes, many of them, Ukraine in the 1990s and stuff, go back and forth. So I sort of imagine a much more kind of fluctuation. This is very common. That's what I would imagine in the United States.
And to tie everything that you've talked about to us in Canada, what is our future going? How is our future going to change, and what does it all mean for us in Canada?
Well, I think that the one silver lining, I think, of Trump and his attacks on Canadian sovereignty, I think that we here sort of are much more appreciative of what we have. I think in terms of kind of efforts by one party not to sort of mimic sort of Trumpian techniques in terms of attacks on the media, I think are harder. I think the parties are less there's less sort of authoritarianism is much weaker here in Canada. But I also think there are other things that, I think we have that we should really focus on preserving, which is, Canadian media, Canadian fact-based media, things like the CBC and other fact-based media, which are hugely important in terms of preserving. So I think all of us can, what we can do is we can pay for subscriptions to the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Star, support the CBC. These are all kind of organizations which really bolster democracy. I mean, one of the things that made democracy so vulnerable in the United States is that people couldn't agree on basic facts like who won the 2020 election, and so that obviously made the United States incredibly vulnerable. So I think that's something that we're still in a position where there is sort of broad agreement on basic facts like that, but that's something that can go away. So I think it's something that we should preserve. I think that, to me, one of the most important things is the media.
Great. I love that you mentioned media, because for the last question, I always ask for movie recommendations.
So I think I've been thinking a lot about Watergate. So All the President's Men from 1976.
Great.
So yeah.
Thank you so much.
No problem.